I think if you mobilize religious thought, then I have a great hope that that can have a real positive influence on the environment, providing it is, if you like, helped with science, obviously. I think you have to fuse science and faith at that point.
We're in a hole, and we're going to do the best we can to get out of it. And there's no point dwelling on the fact that you might not succeed.
Hello and welcome to the Unbelievable Podcast, the show that brings Christians and non-Christians together to debate the topics that matter to all of us. I am your host, Andy Kind. And today we're diving into a fascinating debate on the topic of faith, science, and the future of humanity. And not only that, but with the advances in science, AI, and social media, what is the future role of religion? This discussion addresses loads of questions about the future. What will be the average life expectancy? Will AI create better comedy than humans can create? It's not going to. In 50 years, will the first cohort of people be arriving to live on Mars? Which diseases will have been eliminated? All these questions. We teamed up again with Aylesbury Youth for Christ to bring you this discussion. It's a great debate this time between scientist and Christian Denis Alexander, founder of the Faraday Institute in Cambridge, and atheist humanist philosopher Julian Baggini, author of How to Think Like a Philosopher, and more recently, How the World Eats. So let's see how they got on.
I'm just going to invite you to go along with me on this. I've got a hypothetical, okay? So let's imagine 50 years into the future. Now, the three of us might not be around, but these fine young people probably still will be. So imagine 50 years into the future. AI now means that many jobs that we do at the moment cease to exist. Global warming means that natural resources, such as water, are scarce. Genetic engineering and screening means that many diseases have been eradicated. People are living, on average, well into their hundreds. The first manned flight to Mars has nearly landed to colonize the red planet. How plausible is that future? Dennis?
Thank you. Yes, well, I'm glad I won't be around, actually, but no, but actually I'm generally an optimist about science. One thing you do notice, though, when you get new scientific discoveries and advances, is it's really difficult to predict what's going to happen, even in the next 5 years, let alone 50 years. And we could take many examples of that from looking back in history. The director of our own Faraday Institute is somebody called Graham Budd, who used to be the president and the COO, that means the boss, of a company called ARM that designs chips. All the mobiles of all the people in this room have their chips in their mobiles designed by ARM, because all the mobiles in the world have chips designed by ARM. So the company has done pretty well. And one of the things that Graham always points out is they've had a hard time in his own company with a great team of people predicting really what's going to happen. And if you go back to the futurology books, loads of those futurology books back in the 1960s I used to read about what life is going to be, they all missed out social media. You don't find social media in those books, you see. So, in other words, I'm just pointing out, although many of those things I think you sort of painted for us there, I think, and I hope, and I do pray and hope that there will be realities, especially wiping out many of the genetic diseases we have and that kind of thing. But if you just go to AI, I mean, some of the wild and woolly predictions being made about AI, I suspect are probably not going to happen, because generally, if you cancel out one lot of jobs, you get a whole bunch of new jobs, you see. And there going to be a lot of people who are involved in who are generating AI and controlling AI and running with all the AI applications that it has. So I think it's quite difficult to predict, actually. That would be my main point, I think. Yeah.
Julian, what do you reckon?
Well, I agree with a lot of what Denis has said there. I find it hard enough to predict the next 50 minutes, let alone the next 50 years. So I think it would be foolish to sort of try and guess too much. But I think there are certain things that we do know. You may know this old adage, which is, if you can run away from your problems, but the problem is that you go with you. You can't run away from yourself. And the future will bring lots of huge changes, but we can't run away from our humanity. And in 50 years' time, the kind of human beings who are going to be living are going to be much, much more similar to you and I today than they are going to be different. And human beings bring their own sort of needs and problems and desires, and these things don't change a lot. So to take just a small example, Denis was saying how there's some wild claims about AI. What if AI could create, could write better comedy than human beings could? Would that put all comedians out of business? Well, I think it would probably give us some very interesting comedy. But why do people like comedy? I think what do people like about it is the connection with the person. So there will be different kinds of comedy, if you like. There'll be this really, really smart, funny, clever AI comedy, which we enjoy in some ways. And there will be kind of like human comedy, which we enjoy in other ways. In a similar way that, you may be able to buy a better cake from the bakery or the supermarket than one you can make at home. But if you make a cake for something, it has a different meaning. And that meaning is something, the personal, the expression of love and care and attention. So I think that we're going to be fundamentally the same types of species, and therefore a lot of the same kind of needs and problems are still going to be there.
So let's unpack that if we can a bit more. So let's say improvements in healthcare, improvements in AI do mean that human beings are going to live longer, be able to maybe enjoy life in ways that we don't currently. AI is going to make our lives easier. What is it that is going to change? Because your argument there was, human beings are really going to stay the same regardless of these improvements in AI or technology or science. Can I just push you maybe a bit on what might change for these young people in the future?
Well, I think what Denis is saying is that it's very difficult to predict. I'd say we didn't see social media coming along, and I think that once you ask people of sort of our age, already this generation is in some ways very alien to us, right? You're very different to how we were in lots of ways. And in other ways, we can totally identify with things that are exactly the same. A lot of the things you're going through around, emotions and relationships and hopes and desires and aspirations. But I think in terms of, one of the things that, let's talk about a continuity rather than a radical change. You talk about the extension in lifespans. That's already happened, right? Historically, we are already living much, much longer on average than we were even 50 years ago or 100 years ago. So what have been the effects of that? I think it's quite interesting. I think one of the things has been more of a sense perhaps of anxiety around death, because when you could live to 80 and that perhaps the average life expectancy is 80, it feels kind of like wrong and terrible if someone dies 60 or 50, It feels like you're being robbed of something. And so you get this sort of anxiety about, I have a right to live longer, if you like. Now, if the average life expectancy goes above 100, 110, that's going to bring anxiety about, making sure you stay healthy and fit and don't die before then. And it's going to make it much more difficult to deal with death when it comes along. And again, this is an acceleration of a change we've already seen. I think that people have always mourned. They've always found the death of loved ones difficult. But not so long ago in human history, the death of people around you was really common. You would expect it. When it happened, I think you grieved as much as you would do now. But you didn't have a sense of kind of injustice, of wrongness, that this is something that should not have happened has happened. And perhaps as we live longer, so it's going to be, I think it'll make it more difficult to come to terms with death when life is longer, maybe.
Yeah.
Could I add something else? Yes, I agree with that. I think that's true. And I think the dream of a long age is, living a long age has got all kinds of problems mixed up with it. But I wanted to mention something else, actually, because sometimes I think, obviously, in this country, we're thinking about, all the bad things that might happen in our own country. But I'm just thinking of global warming and the rise of sea level, and we're not doing very well, as you very well know, about controlling global warming right now and CO2 emissions. And it'll be the poor people of the world who will suffer. And that is really what concerns me, I think, most of all. And if you go to Bangladesh or somewhere like that with a very low coastline. You imagine the rise in sea level of 1 meter or 2 meters, again, thinking about 50 years' time. That's going to be a huge challenge, really, to control that, to try and help people in that context. Some people say, oh, well, we'll find out the technologies that will solve the problem and so on, but really, that may partially help, but it's going to be a real challenge in 50 years' time. And a lot of the world is going to be underwater in 50 years' time that won't be under the water now, especially coastlines, low-lying coastlines, and many of those are where the poorest of the world are living. And I think that should be a real concern. And so I think we need to be cautious about thinking about 50 years' time and all the wonderful things, the wonderful technologies we're going to have that will make us all healthy and better. But also we really need to be thinking about those from low-income countries, where that's going to be a very big challenge, I think.
Can I just come in quickly on that, because I think it's an important point, but I'm very aware, speaking in front of an audience of this kind of age, that we're told a lot that there's this real sort of like eco-anxiety amongst a lot of people this generation, that you kind of feel the future's doomed and it's just not there for you. And I wouldn't want people to think that either. I don't think Dennis was suggesting that, but I think there are going to be huge challenges and potentially big problems. But one of the things, a constant of human beings has shown, is that we are quite ingenious, we are quite adaptable. And yes, the worst off are going to suffer the most, that is true. But the idea that there's nothing that can happen, we're doomed, I wouldn't want anyone to think that. And it is this generation who have inherited this problem. And I don't think we should be blaming older generations too much. I think there's too much generational blaming. There are lots of people who are doing what they thought was exactly the right thing. But for whatever reason, you've inherited this problem. I think you have the capacity to overcome it and to at least deal with it and cope with it, muddle through, as it were. So I just wouldn't want anyone to get too pessimistic about this. Don't believe that you're doomed.
So I just want to stick with global warming, stick with climate change. We're going to have people in the audience who are studying science, people who are studying geography. You're going to be the ones who have to go out and solve these problems that you've inherited, like Julian has mentioned. And this talk is about science, faith, and the future of humanity. So Denis is a scientist who is also a Christian. Julian is a philosopher who is a humanist. Could I just ask you both, do you think science or faith will have the best answers to solve these existential problems around the environment?
I think it's always a mistake to go for either or. I'm not saying question's a mistake, but I think so many of these questions come down to both and. It's not a question of either or. I think that mobilizing the faith communities of the world in terms of the problem of global warming can have a huge effect. I mean, if you got on board, and most people in the world, 80% are people of faith of some kind, different religions and so on. But if you get them on board in terms of their own environmental care in their environments and so forth. I go to India quite a bit. I've been there back in December, and just thinking of the vast population and the huge challenges there, but also the huge commitment to religion in India and so forth. I think if you mobilize religious thought, then I have a great hope that that can have a real positive influence on the environment, providing it is, if you like, helped with science, obviously. I think you have to fuse science and the faith at that point, and you have to make sure that faith communities know the science is reliable. We all know that, especially in some parts of the world we won't mention, there's a kind of a lobby that doesn't even believe that global warming is due to human activity. That's a toxic religion, if you like. Some of it comes out of toxic faith. There's plenty of toxic faith around. So I think science can have a real role in working with religious communities to work together to solve this problem. And I'm somewhat of an optimist, despite what I was saying earlier, that the problems can be solved. And I agree with Julian on that point. We shouldn't get too laden with doom and gloom. But I just think it's a great mistake if if the scientific community ignores faith communities and the potential they have, because these are ground level. You've got them all over the place. So you've got mosques, and you've got synagogues, and you've got temples, and you've got all these communities, and they need to be mobilized in a certain direction. That has a huge influence, I think.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I'm not really, although I'm an atheist humanist, I'm not that interested in sort of dividing the world up into sort of like the believers and the non-believers and then having some kind of battle. I mean, a phrase I sometimes use is like a coalition of the reasonable. So in other words, there are a lot of very reasonable, intelligent and pragmatic people who are of faith and without faith. And then there are the nutters, and there are nutters in both camps on the extremes. I think what's important is that the reasonable people, irrespective of their religion or not, work together. And one of the things that involves, as Denis says, is harnessing the best features of religion. Because, you know, what is, as someone who's not religious myself, I'm perfectly able to recognize what religion at its best looks like. And at its best, it calls people to service, it harnesses a sense of community, higher purpose, and it mobilizes people to do good for the world for that reason. Now, why would you not want to harness that when we need to do all that we can to come together? The only point I'd say is that we do, you know, that's fine, but there are also millions, billions of people around the world who are motivated to do good simply by virtue of recognition of our shared humanity. I think that's a fundamental basis. When we talk about toxic religion, religion becomes toxic when it basically elevates its theological views and its sort of doctrines above the need to basically the recognition of our common humanity and our need to love and serve one another. And at the same kind of way, the scientific worldviews, you know, there have been examples of rational scientific worldviews which almost like see human beings as disposable pawns in the march of progress. That's wrong as well. So I think it's all about bringing it back to that common humanity. And then, so again, it's not science or faith, because science by itself just provides means and mechanisms. We need to use them wisely, and that requires people of good faith in that broad sense, not religious sense, of good intention to work together to make sure it happens.
So I think what I'm really getting is that you're both quite optimistic people. Now, I'm generally quite optimistic, but I'm going to be a bit negative. So both of you have mentioned this idea of sort of toxic religion. And we know that we're a very small country. We don't commit a lot of sort of CO2 if you compare us to countries like China or India. And then I'm going to finish with the United States. It could well be that within the next, I don't want to get too political, within the next 6 months, we have a president in the White House who in rallies, campaign rallies, and my year 12 students will know this, his slogan has been drill, baby, drill. It's a return to fossil fuels, it's climate science denial, it's ignore global warming, it's isolationism, America first. How can you two, this is about the faith in the future, how can you two remain so optimistic when that is a reality that we could all be living with in the next 6 months?
Yeah, so optimism doesn't apply to every single thing that happens in the world. Okay, so yeah, there's some pretty depressing things that may happen, and you just described that one pretty well. And I find that terrifying, actually, to be honest. So there's one, I would want to make a distinction between general optimism, taking a broad view and taking an overall picture of what's happening, with specific things that are happening right now in this world. Frankly, okay, so I know we're not being political. I've been very happy with the past few days about our UK election results. I will confess that quite openly. So, and that increases my optimism. And I look over to the White House. Actually, my son-in-law is the science correspondent for the Times. He used to be foreign correspondent for the Times in the USA. So he covered the White House a lot. And that definitely increased my pessimism, okay, just by simply getting all these stories, not just the ones published in the paper, but the other stories you don't get published in the paper. And it's pretty terrifying, really. So I think the kind of, also the polarization, not just who might end up in the White House, but right now the polarization that we're seeing in the United States, I think is very worrying, because it's really 50-50, you know. And I think that is concerning. It's when you've got this very extreme poles. And I think there's some toxic religion in there. I'll be the first to admit some of it's toxic Christian faith. So when you belong to a faith, generally you're most critical of your own faith. Okay, that's the way it goes. Just the way that we are most critical of our own country and make jokes about it. You have that in the faith community, just as you have it in left-wing groups who are a bit similar in some ways in that way as well, some of them extreme left. So, and so forth. So I think I can see I see some role for toxic Christian faith tied in there, which I think is a real problem. And there are groups in the States that are doing something about that, trying. But I will be quite honest, I think that makes me pessimistic about that particular context. But I don't think we should extrapolate particular world contexts and extrapolate them to the whole world, although in this case it will have an influence on the whole world. So, it's tricky.
I think perhaps I'm not as optimistic as I've sounded, right? Now, I'm very bad at remembering who said what. I'm not a very good scholar from this point of view, I'm afraid, so I failed my test. Who was it who said something like the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the heart or the spirit? There's a very famous expression there, and I can't remember who it was, but I kind of agree with that. So the idea is this: if you look at the world and just be as rational as possible, there's so much that's dispiriting about it. There's so much that to think could go wrong and possibly will go wrong. There's no reason to look at the state of the world and think that the next 50 years is just going to be a story of progress and development, right? At the same time, there's no reason to think it's going to be the end of the world either. But the optimism of the spirit, as it were, is the idea that, well, what do you do about it? And I think that whatever your situation in life is, as an individual or as a society, you have to adopt, perhaps optimism is the wrong word, you have to sort of have that constructive positivity about it. Right, we're in a hole and we're going to do the best we can to get out of it. And there's no point dwelling on the fact that you might not succeed. Right. So another person, Jean-Paul Sartre, said famously, we should live without hope, which sounds really depressing, but he meant something quite specific. What he meant was, you shouldn't live with the idea that, things are going to get better, they're bound to, it's inevitable. That's the kind of hope he was saying against. You should struggle for what's worth achieving and set aside, whether you'll succeed or not, is beyond your control, you don't know. But all you can do is struggle to achieve what's worth achieving. So the optimism, I'm only an optimist in the sense that I think that doom isn't inevitable. I've got various things that I could trot out as being positives that humans have, but we can but try, and it's more than possible we'll succeed. That's what we have to do.
Okay, thank you. Don't worry, I'm going to move away from climate change because I think we're all a bit depressed. So I'm going to talk about social media instead. And this probably won't work particularly well for a podcast, but I'm assuming that at least 3/4 of the audience have been on TikTok today. Can I don't want to make you put your hands up, but can you just give me like a general, people are nodding, yeah. I'm going to guess that at least 3/4 of people have been on Insta today. People are nodding. I won't mention Facebook and Twitter because they're for old people. But so the way that young people are now living their lives is in a world that is very different to perhaps how the three of us on stage are living ours. How can those people in the audience who are using social media know that what they're consuming and the content that they are watching and listening to is going to provide them with that hope for the future and isn't just going to lead to doom and gloom, doom scrolling, fake news, post-truth? Big question.
Big question. Okay, I don't claim to be an expert on social media, but I do read a fair bit about the sociology of social media and about its effects and so on. I mean, I think there are a couple of things. I mean, one is it operates by confirming what you already think in some ways, because there's a bubble, isn't it? I mean, we're living in a bubble. We all live in different bubbles. This school is a bubble, okay? And your home is a bubble. And if you go to Cambridge University, it's like a multiverse. There's so many bubbles, You've got different colleges and you've got different departments and faculties. We're all living in these little bubbles. So what social media is doing is taking, actually it may be vast around the world, but it's actually a very small bubble sociologically, because what it's doing is it's feeding you what you want to hear. It's joining you up with other people who think like you, and then it's sort of creating a bubble, a sociological bubble, a community bubble in some ways, but it tends to go in the direction from what I've read anyway, of confirming and feeding algorithms, what then will give you advertising and will sort of keep feeding you with the type of stuff that you believe already. Okay, so that makes it, so the tricky thing then to come part two of the point I want to make is that it actually makes it more difficult then to discern what's just a complete pack of lies. And it is worrying, you know, that a lot of social media will tell you a complete pack of lies. And I think your question really is, how do you find out? How do you discern? How do you know that? And I personally think the only way, well, one way of doing it is simply check it out, you know, but check it out and go to, and this is maybe where the web can be useful, going to really authoritative websites. I mean, you know, BBC News is not, you know, it's obviously biased in its own reporting sometimes, but, you know, they do check things out pretty carefully. If you go to the Guardian website, they will check things out. Journalists are concerned about, their reputation hangs on trying to get stories right. I know that because my son-in-law is a journalist. They spend a huge amount of time. They're really worried about getting something wrong. So I think when you go to social media and something wacky comes up, I would go to other websites and just start checking out some of the more reliable ones, actually. That would be my very pragmatic suggestion.
The reason I ask, and I think it's going to be a big deal in the future, and I don't know if this came up on your guys' socials, there was like a fake Gareth Southgate doing an interview. So AI had generated what sounded like his voice, and they had edited the video to lip sync so that it looked like what he was saying, but it was basically someone who made a joke news conference. And that seems a really silly example, but it was quite funny on social media. But the thought that you could do that with like a scientist or a politician, and that you could be watching a video that seems incredibly genuine in the same voice as the person who's speaking, but what they're saying is, I don't know, let's go to war with China, or do you know what I mean? I find it utterly terrifying, and I worry that if that's the world that these people here are growing up in, how can you tell the difference between truth and reality?
We're going to take a quick break there. If you're enjoying the debate and you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to hit the subscribe bell. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, don't forget to give us a follow. We left the debate on something of a cliffhanger. How can you tell the difference between truth and reality? So don't go away. We'll be back in just a moment.
I really don't think that AI as it is now is on a trajectory to becoming conscious, but it will certainly seem as though machines have conscious minds, and that's a danger.
If consciousness is a property of the brain, then it's subject to what we call causal determinism, physical determinism.
This idea of libertarian free will, I think, is entirely wrong, and I also think is unnecessary.
These systems will become more and more like us. People will treat them and want them to be treated as though they're human. The challenge now is it seems to be going faster and faster.
We are terrible at projecting out long-term consequences.
Robot rights, I can see it coming.
Welcome back to the second part of today's episode of the Unbelievable podcast. We're continuing the debate between Denis Alexander and Julian Baggini as they explore all the questions around science, faith, and the future of humanity. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please give us a follow and visit premierunbelievable.com, our website, where you will find resources, articles, and access to all our past shows. You can sign up for updates there too. Later in the show, we open it up to the student audience for a lively Q&A. But for now, we dive back into the topic of AI, deep fakes, and how can you tell the difference between truth and reality. Here's how the conversation carried on.
I think it's easier for you lot to work out the difference between truth and reality than it was for us, okay? So when I was growing up, how did you find out about how the world worked? You watched the news and you read a newspaper probably, and your newspaper was extremely biased. I mean, you know, the British press they haven't got many newspapers who aren't unbiased. If you wanted to check something out in more detail, what could you do? You could perhaps go down to the library and consult a very old encyclopedia if you had the time. Now, the point is that you're being bombarded with stuff which is not true, right? And nonsense. But you also have the tools. So first of all, I like to think that your generation is smarter than some people give you credit for. The idea that you see something in your feed and go, wow, that's true every time, I really don't think so, right? I think you're very aware that things are fakes. Of course, we all fall for things, but it's not like you're not going to fall for everything. So what do? How do you check? It's easy. The internet, right? The internet, if you use it carefully, you can check. And it's about knowing the reliable sources. So, for example, there's a website called Full Fact. You probably know it. Full Fact is basically what it says. It's a fact-checking website. Any kind of outrageous claim or incredible claim you've heard, tap in and go to Full Fact. You'll probably get some fact check on it, and it will tell you whether it's true or not. So I think you have these certain standards of like hygiene, if you like, intellectual hygiene. You don't just believe what you read, obviously, and you take the time to check it, and you can check quickly. It would take us weeks to check this out in my generation. You can check it out in minutes. So it's having that. When this was being introduced, someone talked about constructive criticism, constructive skepticism. You don't just go, oh, it's all a load of nonsense and dismiss it. But you also don't go, oh, it's all true, and just swallow it. You just ask yourself the question, is this really true? And then you seek to find out. But can I say another thing about social media we haven't talked about, though, which is the other thing they talk about the peer effects. Because people talk about, and I don't know how much this is true, that in a sense there's a kind of bullying on social media and shaming and trying to be in and people sharing pictures. I mean, that is awful and horrible. That is, though, again, just the 21st century version of what has always gone on. There was always bullying in schools. I think there's less bullying in schools now because teachers are much more aware of it. There were the cool kids and all this kind of stuff. There's always been pressure to conform. And the way this generation will deal with it, I think, is the way that every generation deals with it. You reach a point of it's a kind of maturity, a realization that actually, do you know what? It doesn't matter what some people think of you. It doesn't matter what some people say about you. Those people don't matter. And if you get too bothered about it, you're letting them win. So it's about sort of, realizing that you don't have to follow the crowd. You don't have to cave into the pressure. Your own individual. It's perhaps more difficult now because social media may have made it more difficult, but it's an old problem that everyone has to sort of learn to overcome as they grow up and accept themselves for who they are and don't cave into the pressure from people you don't want in your life, basically.
Okay, thanks both of you for that. So I think we've covered social media, we've covered AI, we've covered climate, we delved into a bit of American politics. We're going to take some questions in about 2 or 3 minutes, so start thinking. I know some of you have already got questions. I'm just going to ask Denis and Julian one last question before we come on to your questions, which we haven't covered yet, a bit of a controversial topic. With all these developments in science, technology, AI, media, what is the future of religion? Be as brief as you can, please.
Right, brief. You want brief question on that? Okay, well, I'm neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet, so, excuse me, so it's pretty hard to find. I think one thing you do find, one thing I will comment on, whatever group and tribe and people and race and anywhere in the world, what you find is they have religious beliefs, right? And now and again, you get an anthropologist who discovers some tribe that hasn't been properly looked at, in the wilds of Brazilian jungle or something, and they say, oh, we didn't find a religion, and it's simply they didn't really understand the language. They didn't learn the language well enough, and about 5 years later they said, oh yeah, they do have a concept of the transcendent, and they have these rituals and so on. So I think it's one of the deep, profound characteristics of humanity that all around the world, I'm not saying everybody has religious beliefs, but you simply find religion in all communities and all cultures and everything. And of course, there's a lot of discussion about, okay, is that an evolutionary advantage of that? And you get a whole long discussion, which would take a long time, but which is an interesting discussion. But it does seem to be one of the fundamental characteristics of humankind, I would say, along with language and consciousness and free will and a few other things. Religion is just part of the humanity, and therefore, if you want to ask the question, what is the future of humanity? It may just be what we have. I mean, there'll be many religions, and they'll be part of culture, and some will wax and wane, some will go up, some will go down. It's happened for thousands of years, and so I think it might look a bit similar, actually. That would be my prophecy, but there you go. Prophets can be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think that religion has occurred so much in human history. I think that impulse will remain, but I suppose I'm a bit careful not to sort of over-universalize it. I mean, certainly all human cultures have to kind of come to terms with certain mysteries and the sense of something greater than ourselves in some way. But that masks huge diversity. So if you take China, for example, China is a massive civilization. When the Jesuits went to China, they identified what they called the religion of Confucianism. Now, the Chinese themselves didn't call it Confucianism. It was called Confucianism by the Jesuits because, we named our religion after our founder. So they thought they must have a religion and we will name it after their founder. They called it something else. I can't remember the Chinese name for it, but it's kind of a way of wisdom or something. And there are certain aspects of it which overlap with what we think of as religion, but in other ways it's heavily naturalistic. So I think that human beings always have to find ways of dealing with and orienting themselves towards the mysteries, that which is greater than ourselves, the things we don't understand. I think religion would always be part of a mix of how people do that, but whether or not it will continue to have as large an influence in the future, I really don't know. I really don't know.
Can I add one real quick?
Just very briefly.
Very brief. It's just simply a story. We just had our Faraday summer course, which is a course on science and religion in Cambridge last week. I was chatting with a Chinese girl who's here in this country, third-year philosopher, I won't say which university, raised completely secular environment, parents, members of the Communist Party, and so forth. And really, through philosophy, actually, she's really been pushed into asking the question, hey, what's it all about? What's the purpose? Why are we here? She's asking these very fundamental questions, which she's never asked in her life until doing philosophy at a certain university here in this country. I've had a fascinating discussion with her, actually, because I think that's one reason why you're going to find religions around the world, because people are asking the question, yeah, why are we here? What's the whole point? And so that question will continue to be asked, I think.
There we go. I think the moral from that story is to study philosophy at university. I think that's a great idea. So, Denis, Julian, the questions I've asked you so far have been easy compared to, I'm sure, what some of the questions you're now going to face. Do you think that AI will ever truly overtake humanity in the sense that it might become sentient?
AI is a simulation. Sometimes a very realistic simulation of what we do. You use ChatGPT and, whoa, it looks really quite convincing. But the point is, it's always under human control. I mean, you've got people like Elon Musk who worry about it taking over the world and becoming self-reproducing and all this. It's very much science fiction. But if you're looking at the real ethical issues and the real issues about AI right now, they're much more to do with what we were just talking about with social media. In other words, what is, especially when AI can be used to reproduce the human face and the human voice so accurately, that's much more worrying. And so the potential for AI to make up stuff, they use the word hallucination for AI. So when AI can just make up something, it can make up a citation, you want to write a paper, and it will just make up the citation because it can't find it in the literature. It depends on your database. So the point is that AI is fundamentally, entirely dependent upon human input and human data. And it's these large databases which give it such a good simulation of stuff. But I think most people would say, no, AI is not going to take over the world. It's not going to take over what we do, providing we're careful and we use it as a tool. So the decision is in our hands, in human hands. If we use AI as a wonderful tool, it can be a wonderful tool, especially in medicine, especially in healthcare, especially in scanning images, which would take doctors hours to really to discern, there's something wrong here, there's some funny cells in there. AI scanners can do that in seconds. It's wonderful. So I think it's an amazing tool, and I think it's a tool like all human scientific inventions that can be used for great good and for great evil. Potential for great good and great evil is very high in both categories in AI. So the decision is ours, but I don't think we should worry about the science fiction side too much. I don't think that's what we should be worrying about. We should be concerned about how to use AI in a constructive manner, in a way that is a constructive tool that will help humankind And I think from that, I'm an optimist in that point of view. It has great potential. Whether it can become sentient or not, I'll just leave that to philosophers. Yeah, so...
Yeah, well, listen, I think part of the problem here is, like, if you think about God, the way human beings have conceived of God has too often been to imagine a kind of a more powerful version of ourselves. So, God, rather than being this sort of creature or being which is superior, actually turns out to be sort of vengeful, vain, demanding of worship, all these kind of things which you'd expect of an all-powerful human, really, not the divine super being. AI, similarly, when people think, AI is going to take over, they're imagining AI as like an all-powerful version of Elon Musk rather than AI. Now, David Hume, the philosopher, famously said, "Reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions." And I often misunderstood quote. But what he meant here was that if you think about it, what does rationality, independent of any desires or goals, give you? And the answer is nothing, right? 1 and 1 equals 2 doesn't tell you what to do. A computer could tell you that if you do A, B, and C, you will destroy the whole of humanity. Or if you do E, F, and G, you'll make the average life expectancy go up to 300. But there's no, which one of those you prefer is not a matter of pure rationality, right? A computer can't work out which one of those is preferable. You've got to have a preference for human flourishing over the destruction of humanity. From a disinterested point of view of a computer, neither of them matters. So AI is only going to destroy humanity if it has a desire to destroy humanity. Where would it get that desire from? It could be programmed into it by someone very malevolent, of course. And that's the danger. So I think we always end up going back to ourselves on this. It's how are we going to use it? How are we going to program it? Of course, there's also the possibility of terrible mistakes. You might have heard this one. Let's say you could program an AI to produce as many paper clips as possible, and it does that by destroying everything else to maximize paper clips. You've got unintended consequence. So there's a possibility of an accidental catastrophe. But AI is only going to destroy us, I think, if we program it to. So, which is a serious risk, of course, because there are nasty people who could use it. But yeah.
Okay, I hope you're happy with that question. Death by paperclip sounds like a great way to go. Okay, so just to repeat that question, without the use of an analogy challenge, what is the point of humans achieving anything in life?
Right, so I don't know how you're going to define an analogy here, but we'll see how we go on that one. So this is going to depend entirely on your worldview, so thank you, because now our different worldviews might come out here. So I'm a Christian, so the purpose of being here on planet Earth is to know and worship God. And that's why we're here. And it's something that will take the whole of our lives. And it starts with coming to know God for a Christian through Christ. And that is why we're here. So, and actually you'll find what I said very briefly there in catechisms, which is really, the whole purpose is to know God and to love him and to serve him as a God of love, not a God of wrath, just to come back to my colleague said over there. So God is a God of love in Christian faith, and he loves everybody. And that changes everything, because actually all humankind are made in the image of God. This is not an analogy, but in Christian faith it's a reality, which means that God has delegated to humankind the task of looking after the earth, but also means that everybody is equal value in the whole of humankind. And that's a really key point. I mean, the idea of humanity being made in the image of God was one of the key points in the struggle against slavery and many other evils in the world, because if you really believe that everybody, whatever their color of skin, whatever their education, whatever their genetics, whatever their health is like, if you believe that all people are equal, and that's rooted in a transcendent reality. You didn't make it up. It's not something we just had a nice theory, but that's actually rooted in the whole Christian faith from the beginning. Then that changes a lot of things, actually. And so that's linked also to what it means to worship God. We need to care for other people. We need to go and help the other people as much as we can. We need to love our neighbors ourselves. So that is the core, I would say, speaking as a Christian, of what life is all about.
Julian. Well, I mean, the problem is, obviously, I don't agree with that, but I think the point is, Denis, he hasn't even had the opportunity to explain why he believes that. So, in a way, for me to explain why I disagree with it is to go further than he was able to do himself. The short answer is, I mean, at the general level, I find it totally baffling to imagine why it was the Supreme Being would create all of us to love and worship him. It seems a very strange thing to do. And also to give people unequal opportunity to achieve that goal, because depending on where you live, you're exposed to different religious faiths, sometimes no religious faith at all. So if our purpose is to know and love God, it seems really weird that God hasn't given us an equal opportunity to do that. So that's broadly why I disagree with that. But then what is the purpose? Well, I think, I wouldn't use the word purpose. I think the only word I can use is value. What's the point of anything, you know? And I'm not allowed to use an analogy, unfortunately. But I think that we kind of know it when we recognise it, right? If you ask, in a simple way, if you're sitting outside in the countryside, it's a nice day, you're with people that you love, maybe, or maybe even not, but, you know, especially if you are. In those moments, you recognise this life is worth living. Life is worth living for all that is good in it, and a lot of what is good in it does involve things like love and caring and service, and that has to be enough. As someone who doesn't believe in God, that is enough. And the fact that it doesn't last forever doesn't make it less valuable. And I'm so desperate to use an analogy here, but I'm not allowed to, so I won't. But I think then make up your own analogy. Think of things that are, or example rather than analogy. Things that are really worthwhile. Do you say, well, they're not? It wasn't worthwhile. If you went to a really good concert, this isn't an analogy, it's an example. Good, thank you. If you go to a really good concert, right? You go to a really good gig. I don't know if anyone saw Taylor Swift. I don't even know who she is. But you went to saw Taylor Swift. You don't go, that was a terrible concert because it ended. It was awful. You know, it was great and it finished. So what? Everything in life is good, and the fact that it ends doesn't mean it's not good.
You chose a controversial example there because my wife and my daughter managed to go and had tickets and I missed it, and I'm still upset about that 2 weeks after the event. So we know that these problems exist with social media and misleading information or material being published that's harmful. Why aren't the adults in the room doing anything about it?
Doing anything about it? Well, I mean, we do live in a free country. We live in a country which is entrepreneurial and where people have ideas and where you have companies. And generally speaking, control only comes in when it's very clearly doing serious damage to people. And that's a tricky one, okay, because I've lived in different countries of the world. And, you know, some of the countries I've lived in are very controlled. So your thought processes are controlled. I lived in one country where, you know, social media would be banned, or it would be heavily controlled. Or if you go to China, well, take an example. In China, they've got their own social media, which is entirely monitored by the government, where they listen to everything. They know what you're doing. Your image is taken many times a day, and so forth. So it's a very controlled society. And you do your shopping, you do everything, obviously, with your smartphone, you do your shopping, your banking, everything. Everything you do is controlled, everything is monitored, you see. So I think when you're saying, let's control social media or do something about it so that it's not damaging, to do that without at the same time, in some way, undermining free expression, I think it's really difficult, actually. So it's a tricky one. It's a very tricky one. I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can broadly agree. I think the problem is that it sounds easier than it is. The worst thing you can do is to give any kind of like state authority too much power to control what can and cannot be said. So that is a real big break to just rushing in and doing something quickly. However, I think that's possibly been a bit of an excuse. We do have restrictions. We've always restricted what people are allowed and not allowed to say. And I think the point is the social media environment has come in, and the policy perhaps hasn't kept up to date with it. And maybe at the end of the day, partly this ends up being a matter of will. You know, when there was a global pandemic, people found a vaccine very quickly, right? We've had social media for 20 odd years now. If there'd been enough will to sort it out, probably perhaps we could have not eradicated the problems completely, but got on top of them more. So I think it's possibly a question of not enough effort and priority going into it. But I think it is important to recognise it's not straightforward. Just saying ban this has all sorts of implications, unfortunately.
Amazing. I think, sorry, we've just run out of time for questions. I know there were people who had some. If you do, you can come and talk to the panel at the end, just afterwards. Thank you so much for being a wonderful audience. Thank you to those of you who asked questions. And could we just finally thank Denis and Julian for their time this morning.
That brings us to the end of today's debate, and I think we can all agree with atheist humanist philosopher Julian Baggini, who said that humans are quite adaptable and ingenious in adapting to our changing circumstances. There are lots of problems, but there are amazing opportunities for creativity, science, and innovation. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. As always, do you have questions that weren't answered today? Well, why don't you let us know? We'd love to hear from you. Visit us at premierunbelievable.com. Do get in touch. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please give us a follow, or at least consider it. If you're watching on YouTube, please press the like button, hit the subscribe bell, and do what you got to do. And remember, you can explore other shows and articles on our website. The address is on the screen right now. Right now. Thank you for joining us today. Until next week, from me and all the team, goodbye.